So today we are talking about Russian nationalistic music from the Romantic period. We're going to be talking about 7 composers. We're going to be talking about Mikhail Glinka, the Mighty Five, and Tchaikovsky. Let's talk about nationalism first, though. So nationalism is one of the big elements that comes up in Romantic music, but it's especially important for fringe countries outside of the European mainstream. So countries like Russia, like Poland, like Bohemia, like Spain, like Hungary. Nationalist music was essentially like a form of propaganda. It was, music can be like a spiritual call to arms. So Russia had the iron fist of the Tsar keeping the people down. But activists who might have been shut down by the government for going against the oppressive rule, artists had often had more freedom. Musicians could express longing for freedom, pride, and traditions, and this was often helped along by this romantic notion of the folk. The music of the common people was raised as this way of bringing about these nationalistic ideas and ideals. Okay, so nationalism is defined as the conscious use of a body of folk music. So folk music appears in music throughout the classical and romantic periods, but it was the purposeful use that made it nationalistic. So Brahms and Schubert in mainstream European music, they used folk music, but it wasn't considered necessarily nationalistic because it wasn't used intentionally. It wasn't the primary voice of that music. So nationalist composers are so influenced by the folk music of their people that they compose with the voice of their people. So, like I said, we're going to talk about those 7 composers, Glinka, the Mighty Five, and Tchaikovsky. Doesn't the Mighty Five sound like another X-Men episode? Before we get there, before we get to Glinka, we got to talk about what was in Russia before that. Italian opera was, when people talked about opera in Russia, that's all they really knew. Russian classical music wasn't very developed yet. 1850 was the first conservatory to come about in Russia. There were few music teachers, there were few music schools, there were few music books and publications. In St. Petersburg, there was one organization called the Russian Philharmonic Society, but it only gave 2 concerts each year, so there's not much there. In Russia, other arts were given higher social status than music. There could be artists of the state, like sculptors and painters, but musicians couldn't be considered artists of the state. That brings us to Mikhail Glinka, who effectively founded the Russian National School, and he was kind of made into a god figure by his successors. He started out a dabbler, a dilettante, as many of these characters did, writing mostly second-rate music in the style of Europe. But then he wrote 2 pieces, A Life for the Tsar and Ruslan and Ludmilla. Both of these are Russian folk tales, and they totally took off. Then he wrote a piece called Kamenskaya, and this really sealed the deal for him as the leader, sort of the pre-leader of the Russian classical music movement. Tchaikovsky later wrote of Kamenskaya that he likened it to an acorn, saying that the present Russian school is all in Kamenskaya, just as the whole oak is in the acorn, meaning like the blueprints for all of the Russian music that was to come is in this piece that he wrote. Like many of these characters, Glinka was born into a wealthy family. They weren't all born into wealthy families, but he had a really sketchy music education, and this is a trend with most of the Russian composers. He had some violin and piano lessons, and then in his 20s he traveled to Europe and met some of the famous Italian operatic composers, and then he brought that back to Russia. So he used, in his first works, he was sort of straddling Russia and Europe. So he was using European forms that the people were familiar with in that concert setting, but he was also introducing Russian folk songs and Russian folk dances and mixed meter things, but just a little bit. And so this became this big, the Russians really rallied around it, but at the same time it made sense to them sonically because of what they were used to. Later in his career, he started really pushing the envelope a little bit, and this didn't work for him. He started using a lot of mixed meter, and that was too far out for a lot of the people in the concert scene, and he sort of fell out of favor to the masses. He went back to Europe and he died of a cold there in 1857. But back in Russia, he was sort of deified as this superhero, as the grandfather of Russian music. Enter the Mighty Five. Mily Balakirov was the first. He was the leader for a big chunk of the time. He was born in 1837. He also had no particular musical training. He owned no books on harmony or orchestration. But he hears the operas of Glinka and he decides to devote his life to composing. He was super strong and opinionated, and he became the leader of the Russian music scene after Glinka's death in 1857. At this point, Balakirov is just 20. And around him starts to gather what is known as the Russian Five. It was more than just five, but starts with five major characters. All of them are dilettantes, they're dabblers, they're active professionally in other fields. Balakirov is more of a catalyst than a composer, Tchaikovsky later observed. He was really the force that kept the group together. Next on the scene is César Cui. He was an army officer and an engineer. He specialized in building fortifications. He was the least talented musician of the bunch, but he was an important member of the Mighty Five in terms of disseminating ideas. He was a critic, he was a writer, he wrote articles that appeared as far away as France. Next on the scene we have Modest Mussorgsky. He seemed an unlikely potential member at first. He was an 18-year-old ensign in the Preobrazhensky regiment, and he had a list of skills. I'm going to read you this list. It's amusing. This is written by Arnold Schoenberg. He writes that Mussorgsky knew how to drink, how to wench, how to wear clothes. He was a dandy with a lot of interesting fashion choices. He knew how to gamble, he knew how to flog a serf, and he knew how to sit a horse. Drinking was apparently his greatest strength. He also played piano though, and he was taught by his mom how to play piano. But above all, his love was music, and he was swept up in the energy and the spirit of Balakirov, and he resigned from the army in 1857 to study music full-time. Mussorgsky's family had lots of money. They had lots of serfs under their serfdomage, and so he didn't really struggle until 1861 when the serfs were emancipated in Russia, and he had to take a civil service job to make ends meet. Next, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. He was a naval officer. He was also from an aristocratic family, and he was even less accomplished a musician than Mussorgsky. He played a little cello, but he loved the idea of composing, and finally he was introduced to the boss man himself, Balakirov, who saw something in Rimsky-Korsakov and really encouraged him to compose a sketch that he made. And then in a letter, Balakirov wrote of the Mighty Five, he wrote that Cui was a talent but not a human being in the social sense, and that Mussorgsky was practically an idiot, but Rimsky-Korsakov, I put my trust in you, he said. He told the young naval officer like an old, next we have Alexander Borodin. And he joined the circle in 1862. He was the illegitimate son of a Russian prince, and he worked as a scientist, a chemist really. And he was also an amateur pianist, and he fancied the idea of composing. He wanted to get involved. So all told, here we have the Mighty Five. We've got this domineering boss man, we have an army engineer, we have an ensign, we have a naval cadet, we have a chemist, and then there were peripheral members too, art historians and critics and things, but that was the main five. And so they had like music nights. They had basically like book groups almost, but for music. They would get together, they would listen to music, they would read scores, they would play music, they would play each other's music, they would talk about composing, and together they sort of developed this Russian musical voice. And they really believed in each other's successes. They supported each other, especially at first. No sense of envy or competition. Each is made sincerely happy by the smallest success of another, said Borodin. They preached this idea of truth in music, this Russian truth, and that is sort of reaction against the academic conservatory music of Europe. So where in Europe there was this sort of constructed ideas that had developed over time, in this Russian school they were saying, you know, to hell with that, let's be raw, let's be true to ourselves and our people and our country. And that was this nationalistic idea. The villains of Russian music to them were like Rubinstein, who was the head of one of the big conservatories in Russia, and he represented to them Western learned tradition. It would be a serious error to consider Rubinstein a Russian composer. Cui wrote. He is merely a Russian who composes. So the dislike toward the Western establishment is reciprocated by the conservatories. So the Russian Five really disdained, they really disliked that European model of conservatories, and the conservatory folks felt the same way about them. Tchaikovsky was a member of that conservatory group. He's a Russian, he's writing Russian music, but he's also a conservatory Russian. So he sort of straddles both worlds. And Tchaikovsky wrote in a letter, "All the newest Petersburg composers, speaking of the Mighty Five, are very gifted persons, but they are all afflicted to the marrow with the worst sort of conceit and with a purely dilettantish confidence in their superiority over all the rest of the musical world." Tchaikovsky was impressed with Rimsky-Korsakov, but also Rimsky-Korsakov ended up at this point being a professor of composition at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. Tchaikovsky called Cui a gifted dilettante and unoriginal, Borodan a 50-year-old chemistry professor, but with less taste than Cui and weak technique. Mussorgsky he called a has-been. The most outstanding person of the circle is Balakirev, he thought. But he's grown silent after accomplishing little. Nevertheless, these powers exist, said Tchaikovsky. Even a Mussorgsky, by his very lack of discipline, speaks a new language. It is ugly, he said, but it is fresh. So Tchaikovsky is recognizing this new, fresh musical movement on the scene. So in the 1860s, the Russian Five worked together. This is a decade where they're really working together. They're putting on concerts of Russian composers, including Tchaikovsky. So they're inviting Tchaikovsky to sort of they support him because he's Russian. Balakirev was so tight-fisted that the group began to branch out more than he was comfortable with. The group started developing, they started putting on more concerts, they started inviting other people in. Everybody's music started developing. Rimsky-Korsakov joins the conservatory scene, and Balakirev couldn't deal with it anymore. His group unraveled, he thought, so he felt rejected and useless, and he became a religious fanatic and a railroad worker. Mussorgsky was the first of these people to produce a masterpiece. He labored over his musical voice and philosophy, and he landed on this concept of sung speech, that the Russian language itself has a certain cadence and rhythm, and this is true of any language, but he really sunk into that, and so he created sort of this Russian musical voice. He despised anybody who took the easy way out or to pander to people's tastes. Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov was a Russian folk story, and it was really popularized. Boris Godunov is the masterpiece. It was really popularized when Rimsky-Korsakov did reharmonization and reorchestration of it. Rimsky-Korsakov was a master harmonizer. Rimsky-Korsakov ended up becoming the grand old man of Russian music. He has this incredible beard. Serious beard envy over this guy. He starts working at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, and have hope, those of you who are interested in music but who are not music theory experts. He writes, Rimsky-Korsakov writes, that it was not merely that I couldn't at that time have harmonized a chorale properly, had never written a single contrapuntal exercise in my life, and had only the haziest understanding of strict fugue, but I didn't even know the names of the augmented and diminished intervals, etc., etc. So he's talking about how he enters into teaching at the conservatory and doesn't even really have the vocabulary for it, and so he has to really start plunging into some of the European classics to make sense of what he's supposed to be teaching to people, and that made the Mighty Five furious. He had sold out. The Mighty Five had hatched into a horde of soulless traitors, snarled Mussorgsky. So the Five starts to unravel, and what's interesting is that Rimsky-Korsakov, who sort of started that unraveling, Balakirev left and then Rimsky-Korsakov left. Rimsky-Korsakov ends up as the grand old pappy of Russian music. When Rimsky-Korsakov dies, Stravinsky, who was a student of his, is kind of the successor, but Russian music is considered dead for a while. When Rimsky-Korsakov dies, he becomes sort of the keeper of that flame. Alright, we're going to carry on in another video in a moment when we are going to concentrate on the life of Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, the most famous of the Russian composers.